Sherlock Holmes, The Adventure of the Speckled Band. In the heart of London, at the eternally fog-kissed address of 221B Baker Street, life in the early 1880s moved at its usual brisk pace, filled with the endless rhythm of cab wheels, the calls of newsboys, and the occasional distant tolling of a church bell. It was a time when gaslights flickered in shop windows, hansom cabs clattered over cobbled lanes, and the mysteries of men often crossed the threshold of a certain apartment to meet their match in a man named Sherlock Holmes. It was during one of those crisp and grey mornings in early April that Sherlock Holmes, the consulting detective whose name had begun to spread like quiet fire through the whispers of London's curious elite, found himself roused from his violin and his thoughts by the hasty arrival of a young woman, cloaked heavily despite the spring. She entered not with the nervous hesitance of the merely curious, but with the trembling urgency of someone fleeing something unspeakable. Dr. Watson, ever the loyal companion and narrator of Holmes's more dramatic affairs, noted her attire before anything else. Though of gentle breeding, the woman's clothing was worn and dusted from travel, her veil pulled low, her gloves still clutched as if her hands had forgotten how to release them. But more than her clothing, it was the condition of her face that spoke volumes, eyes rimmed red with sleeplessness, lips pale, and every line drawn as if she had aged in a fortnight. Her name was Helen Stoner, and her story, when at last she began to tell it, spilled forth like a long-contained storm breaking loose. She was a resident of Stoke Moran, an estate in the rural heart of Surrey, a place that had once known grandeur but had, over time, fallen into disrepair under the stewardship of her stepfather, Dr. Grimsby Roylott. Dr. Roylott, she explained, had once practiced medicine in India, a man of intellect and ability. But misfortune, violence, and bitterness had twisted his character into something harsh and cruel. After being imprisoned in India for a fatal altercation with a native servant, he returned to England, a shadow of the physician he had once been. There, he retreated into isolation within the walls of Stoke Moran, accompanied only by Helen and her twin sister, Julia. The family's wealth had not come from Roylott, but from Helen's late mother, who had bequeathed a considerable annual income to be divided between her daughters when they married. Until such time, however, the funds remained within the control of Dr. Roylott, a legal detail that, in retrospect, would prove far more than an inconvenience. 2 years prior, Julia had been engaged to be married. Mere weeks before the wedding, strange occurrences began to unsettle the household. At night, she complained of low, whistling sounds, barely audible, drifting through her chamber. She sensed unease, dread even, though nothing tangible seemed amiss. Then, one dreadful night, Helen was roused by a scream, a shrill, sharp cry that pierced the stillness of the old house. She rushed from her room to find her sister dying, collapsed upon the floor, her limbs twisted in a grotesque pose of agony, her mouth frothing, her eyes wide with terror. With her final breaths, Julia had gasped of something terrible, Speckled Band. Then she was gone. No signs of violence. No explanation. No intruder. The inquest yielded no result, and the official verdict was death by unknown cause. Time passed, though grief never truly loosened its grip. Helen continued to live under Roylott's roof, and though the memory of that night haunted her, life assumed its slow, uneasy rhythm once more. Until now. Until Roylott had begun altering the house. Repairs, he called them, though few believed he cared for comfort. And due to these so-called renovations, Helen was relocated to her sister's old room, the same in which Julia had died. And soon, the whistling began again. Stoke Moran stood in the countryside of Surrey like a wounded animal, weather-worn, crumbling, and withdrawn from the world that had long outpaced it. The ancient manor, once proud in stature, bore the weary lines of time and disuse. Its stone walls were chipped and pockmarked, its ivy-covered facade sagging with decades of neglect. The windows, narrow and dark, resembled sunken eyes that had seen too much and spoken too little. It was to this house that Holmes and Watson journeyed the following morning, their carriage winding along rutted roads bordered by wild hedgerows. The clouds overhead hung heavy, low, and colorless, mirroring the mood of anticipation that hung over the two men. Holmes sat in deep concentration, tapping one long, pale finger against his lips, his eyes distant. Watson, accustomed by now to his companion's long silences, sat patiently beside him, his mind lingering on Helen's pale face and the strange, haunting phrase, "the Speckled Band." As they approached the estate, a figure appeared in the distance, tall, imposing, and unmistakably out of place in the rural quiet. It was Dr. Grimsby Roylott himself. His long limbs carried him in wide, powerful strides, and his face, marked by a hawk-like nose, deep-set eyes, and a brutal mouth, radiated menace even in repose. He wore a top hat too large for his narrow crown and a heavy cloak that billowed in the wind. Around his shoulders, the shape of a coiled whip suggested something far more sinister than an accessory. He did not stop to greet them, but marched toward the nearby village with a black scowl, his cane swinging like a threat. Once the doctor had passed out of sight, Holmes and Watson continued on, welcomed discreetly by Helen, who had returned ahead of them. The interior of the manor was no less forbidding than its exterior. The walls were lined with dark, cracked wood paneling, and a musty smell lingered in the air, a scent of damp stone, mildew, and something faintly chemical. Helen led them swiftly through the winding halls, her footfalls nearly silent, as though long accustomed to moving quietly in her own home. She brought them first to her own room, the one in which her sister had died, the heart of the mystery. It was a small but elegant chamber, with old-fashioned furnishings, a fireplace of dark marble, and a solitary window overlooking the gardens below. The bed, large and wooden, stood close against the wall, the headboard aligned precisely beneath the narrow ventilation shaft. Holmes immediately began his examination. He moved with meticulous grace, inspecting each feature not as a man looking at furniture, but as one reading a hidden code embedded within the very architecture of the room. His eyes moved to the bell pull, a long, frayed rope hanging just above the bed. With a single tug, he revealed it to be a deception. It was not connected to any bell. It led into the wall and ended there, affixed as if for appearance only. Next, his attention turned to the ventilator itself. A narrow, square opening just above the headboard, no larger than a man's palm. A curious feature, Holmes remarked to Watson, given its position. It was not placed to allow air from the outside to circulate, as one might expect, but rather to connect directly into the adjoining room, the private chamber of Dr. Roylott. They entered Roylott's bedroom next. It was sparsely furnished, almost brutally so. A camp bed, a small side table, and a large iron safe sat against one wall. On the table lay a saucer of milk, curious in the absence of any domestic cats. Upon further inspection, Holmes discovered a small lash or leash, crafted from fine leather, looped and coiled like a serpent. It was a room designed not for comfort, but for control. Having completed their inspection, Holmes and Watson took their leave, promising Helen they would return after nightfall. She was to retire elsewhere, as Holmes suspected the killer's method relied on her presence in the bed. She agreed with a mixture of courage and dread, and as she watched the detectives depart, her hand lingered on the doorframe of her sister's old room, as though trying to feel some last trace of warmth from what had once been innocence and safety. As the sky darkened into dusk, Holmes and Watson settled into a small inn within the nearby village. Over a sparse meal and weak tea, Holmes shared his thoughts with Watson. Though the pieces were not yet all in place, he was close, painfully close, to seeing the full picture. The danger was real, he said, perhaps more so than anything they had yet faced. For they were not merely unraveling a puzzle of greed or deception, but one that used the silent, deadly tools of nature itself. That night, they would return to Stoke Moran. They would lie in wait in the dark, silent bedroom of the dead. And whatever evil had claimed Julia Stoner would try again. Only this time, Holmes would be ready. The wind had picked up by the time Holmes and Watson made their return to Stoke Moran. The moon hung pale and half-veiled in drifting clouds, casting a sickly silver light across the Surrey countryside. Their carriage moved silently over the gravel path, the hooves of the horse muffled by the soft damp of the soil. In the distance, the outline of Stoke Moran rose once more into view, a silhouette of crumbling stone and sagging rooftops, a house with too many shadows and too few living souls. Helen had done as instructed. Her belongings had been quietly removed from her chamber, and she had retired to a safer part of the house under the guise of sleep. Roylott, apparently unsuspecting of any interference, remained in his own room, his intentions likely set on repeating whatever malevolent ritual had taken Julia's life 2 years before. Holmes and Watson slipped into the house through the side door, keys provided discreetly by Helen. They moved through the halls in complete silence, each footfall calculated and light. Every creaking floorboard, every gust through the cracked windows, sounded amplified in the hush of midnight. At last, they reached Helen's room, the scene of past terror and the anticipated trap of the night. Holmes closed the door behind them and silently locked it. They lit a single candle, hooded it, and placed it near the floor so that its faint light barely reached the walls. Then they took their positions. Holmes sat in the corner near the fireplace, eyes fixed on the bell rope and the ventilator above the bed. Watson took his place by the window, his revolver hidden but ready, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the thick weight of expectation. Outside, the garden trees rustled in the breeze, their leaves scraping softly against the windowpane. For hours, they waited. The room grew colder as the night deepened. The old stone walls seemed to breathe chill through the cracks in their surface, and the air hung heavy with an unnatural silence. Even the wind outside had begun to still, as if nature itself were holding its breath. Then, at last, it came. A sound, soft and sinister. A low, unmistakable hiss, like air escaping through a narrow pipe, but wrong somehow, serpentine in quality. It came not from the garden, nor the hall, but from above the bed. Holmes rose in an instant. He seized his walking cane, and without a moment's hesitation, he struck the bell-pull savagely, again and again, like a man trying to destroy a serpent in mid-coil. The lash of the cane echoed in the room, a rhythmic violence against the stillness. Then the sound ceased, the hissing vanished into silence. And then, from the next room, came a sound unlike any other. A scream. It was not the scream of surprise, nor even of pain, it was primal, wretched, and final. It rose sharply, pierced the air like a blade, and then dropped into silence, leaving behind only the echo that clung to the cold walls. Holmes flung open the connecting door. Watson followed at his heels. Inside Dr. Roylott's room, the air was thick with an unnatural odor, musky, acrid, and damp. The iron safe was open. The saucer of milk on the table had been disturbed. And seated in a chair by the hearth, frozen in death, was the figure of Dr. Grimsby Roylott. His face was twisted in a contortion of terror and agony, his body rigid, hands clenched at the arms of the chair. Across his forehead, nestled like a crown of death, lay a creature no longer than a walking stick, coiled and still. It was a snake, thin, with a spotted body, and eyes that glimmered with the faintest echo of malice. The pattern along its back was unmistakable, speckled. The band. Holmes stepped forward carefully. He retrieved the cane from his side and, with calm precision, used it to flick the snake back into the open safe, then slammed the iron door shut. The latch clicked into place with a sound that seemed to seal the mystery behind it. It was over. And in the silence that followed, broken only by the distant call of an owl and the soft rustle of leaves beyond the window, Holmes spoke at last, not in triumph, but in cold analysis. The first rays of morning light had only just begun to pale the eastern sky when Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson stepped out of the accursed room. The manor around them remained cloaked in shadows, unaware, or perhaps unbothered, by the death that had taken place within its walls. The house, as though echoing the silence of its late master, offered no sound save the distant creak of ancient timbers and the wind brushing against its aging stones. Holmes stood in the threshold of Roylott's chamber for a long moment, as if absorbing every detail of the scene behind him. His gaze swept over the iron safe, the milk saucer, the loop of dog leather, and finally the chair in which the villain sat slumped, his violence undone by the very creature he had thought to command. Then, without ceremony, Holmes turned and led Watson back to the sitting room down the hall, the same one from which the two men had entered the house hours earlier. Only now did Holmes allow himself to speak in full. He explained, in the calm, clinical tones of a man tying off the last threads of a tangled knot, the true design of the murder. It had been a plot born not of passion or madness, but of cold calculation, driven by greed and enabled by the kind of knowledge that only the East could offer to a man like Dr. Roylott. When his wife died, she left a will that ensured her daughters would receive a substantial annual income upon their marriage. An income which, until then, Roylott controlled. It was not difficult to see why he would seek to prevent their weddings. 2 years earlier, Julia had been engaged. Now, Helen was to be married. Each stood in the way of his continued access to their inheritance. Roylott, Holmes said, had crafted a murder method so subtle and so untraceable that it defied even the medical examiners. Using his experience in India and his connections to exotic animal dealers, Roylott had acquired one of the most dangerous creatures known to man, a rare swamp adder, the deadliest snake in the subcontinent. Silent in its movement, nearly invisible in the dark, and capable of killing in moments, the serpent was the perfect instrument for murder. But it wasn't simply the snake itself, it was the method. Roylott had drilled the small ventilator between his bedroom and his stepdaughter's. He had installed a bell rope that hung directly beside the bed, useless as a call device but essential as a bridge. Each night, when the house was quiet, he would open the iron safe, withdraw the snake, place it through the ventilator, and allow it to descend the rope toward the bed. It would slither down silently in the dark, and with any luck, bite the sleeping victim. Then, Roylott would whistle softly, just loud enough for the trained creature to return. He would secure it again in the safe, and by morning, the victim would be found dead, no wound, no struggle, no sound, and no trace. A natural death in a locked room. Julia had died in agony, her final words lost in confusion and terror. She had seen something, but did not understand it. The speckled band she had whispered about was not a scarf, a headdress, or anything of the sort. It was the snake itself, marked with a pattern of spots along its sinuous body. When Helen had come to Holmes, the detective had noted the peculiar details: the false bell pull, the ventilator leading not outside but into another room, and the bolted bed that forced its occupant to sleep in the exact same position night after night. The design was too specific to be accidental. It was mechanical in its precision, surgical in its cruelty. That night, Holmes knew Roylott would strike again. And so, he had waited. When the hiss of the snake came, Holmes acted not to kill, but to disrupt. His furious blows at the rope had startled the serpent. Disoriented and threatened, it had retreated the way it came, but rather than settling back into the safe, it had turned on the man who had trained and abused it. It had struck him with deadly accuracy. Poetic justice, Holmes had said. Though not something he had intended, it was fitting nonetheless. Holmes confessed that he had known the danger. It had been a gamble, facing a deadly snake in the dark. But it was the only way to catch Roylott in the act. By confronting the method, they had laid bare the motive and the madness. As the sun climbed higher and the mist began to burn off the Surrey fields, Holmes and Watson left Stoke Moran behind them. The manor would soon pass into legal proceedings. The snake would die, locked in its iron tomb. And Helen Stoner, now free from the shadow of her stepfather's tyranny, would be able to marry in peace. For Holmes, there was no glory in the resolution, only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the truth had prevailed, that reason had outwitted cruelty, and that justice, however indirectly, had been done. As their carriage moved down the country road, the detective leaned back in his seat, his eyes closed, not in sleep, but in calm reflection. The case of the Speckled Band had ended. But in its ending lay a haunting memory of a dead girl's final words, a twisted man's fatal arrogance, and a whisper in the dark that would echo forever in Holmes's mind.